Hey, what's going on, everyone? I wanted to give you my quick thoughts on Control. Now that I have finished playing it, I decided to play the Alan Wake DLC expansion to it after completing the main game, and now I'm done with that. I don't really feel any more need to go back into the game, so now's a good time to share my thoughts. First things first, I went into this game thinking it was going to be heavily inspired or heavily following the flavor of the SCP Foundation. And this definitely colored my experience with the first few hours in a certain way. And I think it's colored my experience for at least the main game in a certain way, but the DLC, I think, did a great job of pretty much like scrubbing all that away once I had played through it. Alright, so getting back to the actual game and getting to the first thing I want to talk about is the story. The main line of missions that take you from getting into the role of Director of Federal Bureau of Containment to capturing a antagonistic individual that's causing the outbreak or whatever. The Golden Path missions and gameplay felt lacking, and it felt like it was pulling from a bunch of different games that came out in the last 5 years, like the Healy orbs that protect everyone from Destiny. Those make an appearance as an enemy. Flying enemies that do ground pounds make an appearance. Flying sniper enemies make an appearance. I'm pretty sure I saw both of these in Spider-Man for PS4. Slow floating explosive enemies make their way to you. Sure, these are all mechanics that get used from game to game to game, but for any modern shooter game to release with these enemy archetypes and weapon types, it all makes sense. It's all very standard, and that is what was kind of lacking to me. I guess I was expecting something a little more outside the box than a primarily shooting game. There are abilities and stuff, but again, these abilities like telekinesis, floating, these are all things that are pulled from recent games. I could think if I didn't have Control, I could play Infamous and have mechanically a somewhat similar experience. The combat in general felt okay, but it didn't feel like there was much combat chess going on in my head. I feel like this is the most prevalent in Doom, and especially Doom Eternal. There just didn't seem to be specific strategies or specific weapons or powers to use against certain enemies. There were certainly what not to use against certain enemies, but there was never really something like, oh, okay, I'm gonna throw boxes at this guy, then I'm gonna shoot this guy, then I'm gonna use this specific tactic on this guy. It was always just, I need to dodge, fly, and throw boxes, and once I can't do those first three things, then I'm gonna just shoot a bunch until I can do the first three again. You're just sort of, I guess, juggling your own abilities and cooldown bars. While I'm talking about the combat, I just want to mention as a small note, I would have liked a stickier aim assist, especially while flying. I don't think I really needed it while in ground traversal, but when flying and getting into combat, especially later in the game, I found myself wishing I had an Xbox Pro controller with the paddles on the back, because I just I started Dark Souls clawing my controller at some point, just so that I could fly, hang on to boxes, throw shit, pop a shield if I need to, and it was just kind of a lot. I'm really glad I had all of those abilities available to me, but I do wish it was a bit more ergonomic to use them. So unfortunately for me, I actually ended up skipping a ability or two on the way to the end of the game. Specifically, I know I did not have shield. I beat the entire game without the shield ability, and probably a little underleveled, I'm not entirely sure, because I never understood what rewards I was getting and or when I was getting rewarded for completing side missions. So I completed 2 to 3 side missions probably in the first 2 hours of the game, and I would see the notification this big title, it's complete, congratulations, the mission is done. But as far as I can tell, when reading the mission prompts and selecting missions in the menus, they don't tell you how much it's going to reward you in terms of experience points or currency or what have you. So after doing maybe 2 or 3 of those very early in the game and not seeing any results, I just decided to abandon those completely and stick to the Golden Path, which is to say just the very, very main missions that are needed to progress. And in doing this, I actually hurt my experience a lot, and I only found this out after 1, beating the game, 2, talking with a friend, and 3, watching a review of the game. And what I had learned is that all the crazy like gameplay, big boss fights, and especially weird SCP like stuff is actually saved for the side missions and or the post game. But I don't want to get into the post game stuff just yet, so I'll keep things pre-spoilers for now. Let's jump to the presentation. This game has fucking awesome style. The cinematography is very cool. It's super like sci-fi / FBI with at times I feel a little bit of Twin Peaks, but that may be more attributed to the characters' awkward facial animations / poses at times, and maybe how long the cameras hang on faces before going back to the menu after the conversation. But everything else is like great. Like when you enter a new sector or whatever and the big white text appears and it's just like boom, and you're like, oh yeah. Or like when you first see the hotline room and you're like, oh shit, this looks like Cerebro from X-Men, but then it's just this freaking room with the chair and the hotline, and you're like, whoa, this is like sick. I feel like that's super Remedy style, and like I wanted so much more of that Remedy style with SCP, but and again, this is where my SCP expectations begin to hurt my experience. I was hoping to get more of these Remedy-styled like cinematics and like narrative presentation with the horror elements that the SCP Foundation has plenty of. The only big notable time I had a problem with the game's presentation is when I entered, I believe, 1 or 2 combat encounters, and they were in new areas, so the white text ended up like slamming itself over most of my screen, which is never good when you fling yourself headfirst into a firefight. So my leading thought on the game before playing the DLC, before doing the side missions, was that it was a very watered down SCP fanfic, and it didn't even use the SCP license to its fullest. And that was a very bad take after now playing more of the game and playing the expansion. But I feel like one can't be entirely at fault for making the mistake I did, given the lack of information given to the player when they're receiving upgrades, and also how they tucked away the coolest and weirdest gameplay into these like side quests, either as the intro or the end to the side quest, or even as the post game. So I had this really bad take that the game was a watered down SCP fanfic, and that totally doesn't do it justice. It is better than that, and at some point it does stand on its own 2 legs, but if you were to go into this game and only play like the main thing, that is the impression that this game leaves on you. And it leaves a very dissatisfying ending on top of that. But if you are someone who likes to take their time playing all the side content while they're on their way in their journey, this game becomes this really cool, fleshed out, fun experience. And I think it would have been to the developer's advantage to put at least 1 or 2 of these unique gameplay missions, take it from the side and post like story area and bring it into the Golden Path. I just think the main experience would have been served way better if a boss like Mold 1 would have been put into like the first third as like a forced boss, and potentially like the Anchor or something else like popping up in the middle or towards the end of the game. Those would have been great. Unfortunately, what we got in the main story were a bunch of generic combat archetypes that are fine and have been used in a lot of games, but these become our main bosses and they have like high health pools. It's just like not the mood. It's not the mood that the whole game is like, oh my god. Okay, we can't avoid spoilers at this point, so I'm just gonna have to go ahead and do the spoilers now so I can rant freely. Tell me, how are you gonna go and be like, let's make this cool FBI game cross with SCP, and then just make like the whole main story pretty much FBI shoots the red glowy people? Like you're always fighting humans. You're always fighting humans basically. I think the most not human-like enemy is the weird winged creature, and that thing's invisible most of the time. So like, why is it that like Mold 1 is tucked away? Why is it that the Anchor is tucked away? Why Langston's Runaways was the perfect mission to have like drip fed across like the main story. And if anything, Langston's Runaways is 100% SCP. Like, it's just totally SCP, but it is done in a hunt down actual SCP's mission without the threat of being killed in a horrible way because you're approaching an SCP. Most of the SCPs are just, oh, this thing pulls objects towards it, this thing teleports, or this thing quote-unquote moves fast, which is to say it teleports, but it just has a visual trail that like leads you to where it teleported to. So it's functionally the same, presentation is slightly different. These types of short gameplay excursions, specifically Langston's Runaways, would have been awesome and met my expectations that I had going into the game, but unfortunately these were reserved for after the game, and I think these specifically kick off with the fridge mission, which the director, our main character, says they'll deal with once they're done dealing with the main threat or the main antagonist of the game. And while we're on the topic of boss fights, let's get to the end of this game. I'm pretty sure the final boss fight was the Hedron encounter. Like, raising the Hedron and freeing Polaris or whatever the hell we did, that was the actual final boss. Everything post that fake ending was just a power trip victory lap, which I enjoyed. I definitely enjoyed that. Things got visually freaky, things got like fun in a gameplay sense, and I just got to like lay waste to everyone using cool parapsychic abilities. Very fun time. Unfortunately not very satisfying, especially when the end of that power trip is simply holding a button to trigger a cutscene. Like, there's no boss fight encounter. And this is especially disappointing after you bust your ass getting through the Hedron encounter. At least for me, the Hedron encounter was difficult. I died quite a few times, and it certainly felt like a pretty big fight, so I was expecting something bigger and badder coming up for the final thing, and the main game totally just like deflates itself at the end. Very odd way to end the game, very not satisfying. I will say that they did get me with their fake ending. I was legitimately very upset thinking they were going to end the game on such a like weird bad ending cliffhanger note, but that's exactly like what they wanted, so, you know, good on them for getting me that way. But yeah, it's just really unfortunate that I had such a bad initial impression of this game because the good stuff was tucked away, while all the standard, as seen in other games stuff was all pushed front and center with the aesthetic of eerie sci-fi danger. I also understand from a production standpoint why the enemies never really changed their look, but part of what's scary about SCP is how connected to us they are. Like, they exist in our world, and when they affect our people, it's various people that get affected. So from a gameplay production standpoint, this creates friction because they want to have as few character models as possible to make less work, but now you're encountering the same exact enemy with the same exact body type with the same exact clothes on, and this just feels kind of odd when the idea is that the Hiss are infecting different members of the Bureau, different men and women of different sizes and shapes and colors. They're being infected by the Hiss and being turned into these like functional creatures for you to kill, right? So anytime we see the floating exploders, they always look like a white guy that's been bent in half. You know, he's paled out probably because there's some lore reason, but it's always like some scrawny white guy paled out, bent in half, and then he's gonna follow and like blow up. I understand from a game development standpoint why that is, but I guess like as a player and as somebody who's like kind of trying to immerse themselves more in this world, that was something that popped up in my head, like, it is kind of weird that all these enemies look exactly the same. For some of them it did make sense, for others it didn't, right? Like the Rangers, they're all wearing the same uniform and they have helmets, so it perfectly makes sense that most of them would look the same, and you'd assume that they'd have to pass like a certain physical requirement, so the body type might be similar. But for characters who were like strapped in the chairs and had like exposed chest, or when you could really tell what their body type was, it was just kind of odd that was literally the same exact person every single time. Oh man, I did not even like talk about Jesse the character or anyone at all. Okay, quick rundown of characters because I really don't want to get bogged down in them. Jesse the director, I didn't like them. I don't dislike this director character, I just can't connect to them very well. And I think this might be in part due to how awkward she is, like talking in her head. I get the internal monologuing, but it seems like she internally monologues for a crazy long time, and then she'll give a very like tame response to things. I think there was literally one point in my gameplay where it might have been after the mold boss, where she was like, oh man, I've got to stop reacting like what the hell to everything that happens here. And I literally responded to her, please Jesse, don't. It is the only thing that makes you relatable, because otherwise you don't fucking emote in this entire game. You show up to the bureau that kidnapped your brother and you became the boss, you internally monologued and gave a tame response. You found your brother, you internally monologued and gave a tame response. You found out your brother was working with the main antagonist force that was like fucking everything up, you internally monologued and gave a tame response. At the very, very end, I don't even know if you like fucking gave a monologue or anything, because I just can't remember anything you say at this point. So Jesse Faden, as much as I want to like her character, and I do like the visual design of her character, especially her like civilian outfit, I'm getting off track. So yeah, long and short of it, I couldn't connect to Jesse all that well, but I do hope they can fix her relatability. Like I think it might just be the writing in this case, but something just wasn't meshing well with her character, and it made it hard to connect. Pope, I thought Pope was cool, although I guess, you talk to her after every mission, so she's kind of like your touch-based person. She seemed pretty cool, although I could see her maybe like turning face and becoming evil in like a Control 2 or 3. Ahti's dope. Ahti's dope. Ahti's dope. That's pretty much all I can say. Director Trench, also dope as hell. Director Trench, definitely more or less Max Payne, if Max Payne could actually like commit himself to a job without like, getting taken over by the pills and the booze. So I love the director, and the whole presentation style for like those bits are awesome. The board, I'm like indifferent on. I understand it's like, oh, supernatural entity, like weird talking and stuff. Honestly, the board for me shined as a character when they sounded human. Like, they don't need to sound human all the time, but like in bits where you hear their conversations and it'll say like, disregard this like fake news or something else. Oh yeah, it says like disregard the fake news, or like don't get hyped. Like those are the two translations of the line. That to me read a bit funny, but also kind of gave like more character, because it felt like these weird beings were trying to use it's like the hello fellow children, but coming from a fucking astral plane upside down pyramid. Like, that stuff's cool. That stuff to me fleshes out the world and those characters a lot, at least in terms of like what their attitudes are. But other than that, I can't really say I connected with a lot of the characters. Erish was kind of cool, but whatever. Darling, of course, like pops up all the time, and he's the fun kooky scientist. I liked him. I liked Langston. Langston and Darling were two like characters I really liked, although Langston again, I think it was a thing of like the character faces or something looking weird. I felt like Langston was making a weird face like half the time he was animating. Okay, so the Alan Wake DLC, this was AWE Control's second DLC. For me, this was a super